Warm? Everybody staying warm? Winter has arrived. It's dropped to a frigid 68 degrees. And our winter coats, we have to take them out of mothballs and get them ready. If you know what mothballs are, you're already in another world for most people. So welcome. It's good to have you here. A wonderful Wednesday evening. A couple of quick announcements of things going on in the community. Tonight, we welcome you to VBS College of Jewish Studies. Next week, we will meet at the same time, and our guest will be Professor Gail Leibowitz, who teaches Talmud at the American Jewish University. Next week is Thanksgiving. Next week, you will meet in front of your kitchen with a turkey and stuffing and cranberry sauce and yams and green beans and that gray stuff and pumpkin pie, and you'll give thanks for the bounty of this beautiful land. The following week, which is December the 4th, then our guest will be Professor Gail Leibowitz, who teaches at the American Jewish University, teaches Talmud, and she'll introduce us to the rabbinic tradition by talking about the controversy, the argument between the two great masters of the Mishnah, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, and the two different ways that they understood Scripture and Torah, and how that had a lasting impact on the history of Jewish ideas. So join us for that one. And then on the 11th of December, on the 11th of December, we will take up the question of Chanukah. And the two great characters of Chanukah are Mattathias and Menelaus. Mattathias, of course, is the hero of the Maccabean revolt, and Menelaus was the villain of the story, but actually had a very interesting story of his own in how he wanted to bring Judaism into the modern age. And we will debate Mattathias versus Menelaus. And then in preparation for that other holiday, on December the 18th, we'll welcome Rabbi Ari Schwartzberg, who teaches at the Shalhevet High School, and he'll be talking to us about where Christianity and Judaism separated. Jesus and the rabbis, and why it was that Jews are not Christian and Christians are not Jews. And that'll be for our first semester, and then we'll take a semester break, and we'll come back and I'll give you a preview of the coming semester a little bit later. So please come and join us on Wednesday nights coming up. This coming week on Friday night, we have a beautiful Sephardic service, a service in the Sephardic tradition. We call it Tamarim. It is a beautiful musical service with music taken from Syria, Tunisia, Iraq, and Lebanon, all of the traditional Sephardic communities led for us by Asher Levy, who is our artist in residence. So join us. At 6:30 is the service. If you come a little early, there's a wonderful smorgasbord of Sephardic snacks, a little nosh, as they say in Sephardic, to get you ready for the Shabbos. So join us at about 6 o'clock for the nosh and 6:30 for the service. And Shabbos morning, of course, is Torah study. This week, Rabbi Farkas will be teaching. I'll be out of town. So join us for all of these opportunities to grow and to learn in the community. If everyone will please, sorry? No kidding. We will find out. I don't know. I'm not in charge of that. I'm in sales, not. I'll see if I can figure out why. They're supposed to all be there, so there's all sorts of. No. It's not you. It's probably us. But these things happen. They get eaten by the internet. Okay, so if worst comes to worst, you can watch last year's class over again and see how it goes. If everyone will stand up, turn to the folks beside you and say, "Good evening, welcome. I'm glad you're here." Glad you're here. Glad you're here. And now if you put your arms around your new friends and draw them close, if you're near someone, move over. You need a good warm Jew from Tarzana. And we share a blessing for the opportunity to learn together. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu mitzvotav etzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Hinei ma tov u'manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hinei ma tov u'manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hinei ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim, shevet achim gam yachad. Please be seated. Bible. We learn the Bible. The word Bible comes from the Greek word biblos, which means book, bibliography. The word biblos is an interesting derivation. In ancient Near Eastern languages, B's and P's alternated, and R's and L's alternated. So if you take biblos, B-I-B-L-O-S, and you turn the B into P and the L into an R, you end up with papyrus. That's where the word came from. Papyrus was a grass that grew near the Nile, and it's on papyrus that we made our first paper, and out of paper we made the books. That's different. But biblos means book. The Bible is, it's an interesting, that the book's name is the book, because it is the most influential book in all of Western civilization. And it was the most influential book in all of Western civilization because for most of our history, we believed that the Bible was, in some fashion or way, the Word of God. That this wasn't just an ordinary book written by ordinary authors and published in an ordinary way, that this was in some way a transcendent truth, that this was in some way a truth from beyond, and a truth that was given us as a gift, and a truth that demanded our loyalty and our faithful observance. And that was held by Jews, Christians, even Muslims for most of human history until modernity, until, 500 years ago, when scholars began to ask questions. Spinoza and others began to ask questions about the book and began to wonder whether, in fact, the book was written by God and what it would mean if the book were not written by God. Who wrote it? Under what circumstances was it written? And the question then was, if it's not written by God, then what makes it anything different than any other book? How do you read the book? And that becomes one of the driving questions of modern religious life. If you're in Western faiths, which are scriptural based, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, what makes this book the book? How do we read it? And we who read books all the time, but with a certain set of assumptions about how books are written and what books are, how do we read this book? Before we depart from the Bible and enter the world of the Talmud and later Jewish history, Rabbi Farkas and I wanted to spend an evening talking about this problem. How do we read the book? What makes this book the book? And how do we read the book? Tonight, Rabbi Farkas is going to present our controversy, our debate. We'll take a short coffee break in the middle. We'll come back and we'll tell him why he's wrong. Please welcome my dear friend, Rabbi Noah Farkas.
Hi, everyone. Really nice to see you. Does everyone have these little text sheets? Does everyone have a text sheet? Okay. It's hard to talk about understanding and interpreting the Bible, and indeed, if there is indeed a controversy about it, without asking a deeper question, which is not a problem of the Bible itself, but actually a problem with God. Because if we don't have a problem with God, then we understand that the God that we find in the Bible is the God that we experience in our lives, then there's no question as to whether the Bible or not came from God, because our issue is that it's the God we find in the book that is the God that we're experiencing. And if there's no gap there, then the interpretation of the Torah just flows. So I would argue, first of all, tonight, that our issue is not a matter of the divine origin of the Torah, but principally a theological problem in and of itself, which is, does God exist? How would we know if God existed? How do we know that God doesn't exist? Right? So that means you can't talk about God without talking about October 4th, 1957. October 4th, 1967, a nice fall day in the United States. And for the first time in history, we sent something into space. And by we, I don't mean the United States. Our friends around the other side of the world launched a rocket into space. And the top of that rocket was a little metal ball with little spikes coming out of it. And they released it into space, into low orbit. It circled the Earth for a little while and absorbed some radiation and bounced back some signals back to us, little bleeps and bloops, and came crashing down just a couple of weeks later. Of course, I'm talking about the launch of the first satellite called Sputnik. What Sputnik taught us was that you can't look for God outside of the atmosphere. In fact, the Russians declared shortly thereafter that they went to heaven and found no God there, and therefore God doesn't exist. And so they used that as a sort of a provocative way of trying to promulgate their idea that religion is backwards. It's something finally to be left behind in favor of the state or the community or whatever it is the philosophy of the Soviet Union was at the time. But I think for many of us, even if we didn't like the Russians, there's a lot of what they said which sort of gnawed at us a little bit, right? Well, wait a minute. If God's not out in space, then where's heaven? If God's not out there beyond, as we expand our scientific understanding, and God seems to keep retreating, then couldn't we just ask the question that when we finally pull the curtain back on the universe itself, there's just nothing there? And if that's the case, how then do we understand the book, God's book, the instructions to us laid down supposedly by God over time? And that's what I want to think about with you tonight. I'll give you a 1-minute version of my entire talk, and then I'll go through the longer version. But if you want to leave after the 1-minute version, you're more than welcome to. You got what you needed tonight, and you can get a cup of coffee on the way out the door. I'm going to submit to you tonight that even though our sense of reality continuously changes through scientific discovery, the idea of God itself, and then therefore some kind of interpretive structure to understand what God is, continues to change, but is just as much a matter of truth as anything you can find in science. And because of that, how we come to appreciate and approach God's book, this book, is then a matter not of science per se, but a matter of poetry. And that what we're actually doing when we're engaging in Torah study is of a different kind of knowledge. A knowledge not rooted necessarily in science, but is correlative to science. A knowledge that's rooted in poetry and art and inspiration. That's the 1-minute version of our talk. You guys can go. It's okay if you want to leave. Okay. So, this particular debate about whether or not God wrote the Torah or not, if you already begin to adopt science as a position that is something that you find is a truth-revealing enterprise, and if you believe that psychology is a way of understanding what's going on inside the human mind and psyche as a truth-bearing enterprise, and you believe that engineering is a way that you understand the structures of reality, and physics is a way that you understand how the forces move, even unseen forces move through our world and through our reality as truth-bearing enterprise. And then you look at this book with its giants, and you look at this book with its family and with its miracles. You look at this book with its weird lifetimes where people are living to be 600 years old and 130 years old. And you look at this book with copper snakes that become regular snakes, and you look at this book with manna growing out of the ground or coming from heaven. You look at all of this and you say, Nourishkeit, right? It's a story like any other story. It's got pretty images, right? But I can tell you a more compelling story about an evil galactic empire and a great resistance that has space wizards and cool ships, and that's a way that captures our ideas so much more forthrightly, because it has nothing to do with science. At least that one looks like it appears like it has a feeling of science behind it, although it's always paired with the word fiction. And so for thinkers in the 20th century, who in our sense of modernism, when we were coming out of the demythologizing ourselves and coming out of this idea of the sordid natural past and with the supernatural understanding of the universe coming into the strong sense of humanism finally taking root in Western society, and yet you have this culture, this Jewish culture, that wants to look at the Torah as if it's authoritative. You have these two ideas just pulling each other apart. And so I'm going to show you 3 or 4 different ways of how the rabbis of the 20th century tried to grapple with these two poles. Again, this pole of science on the one hand, and this idea of God and revelation and the Torah on the other. And then we're going to talk about some of those. This is mostly to set the table for a conversation with Rabbi Feinstein. And then at the end of my lecture, before we get into the conversation with Rabbi Feinstein, I'm going to show you 2 texts from the Talmud that I think speak so volumes about what the Torah actually is and should be for us. Okay? So the first is a man named Rabbi Norman Lamb, famous Orthodox rabbi, very powerful in the Orthodox world. If you have your text sheet, it's this first piece. He says, I believe the Torah is divine revelation in 2 ways. That, of course, already is a statement where he's putting his foot down and saying the Torah is divine. Okay? In that it is God-given and in that it is godly. So it is both, we would say in this shul, because we know this language, both subject-oriented and predicate-oriented. By God-given, I mean that he, meaning God, willed that man abide by his, God's, commandments, and that the will was communicated in discrete words and letters. So here, Rabbi Lamb is saying what? The Torah as we find it, the words as we found it, the words as it comes to us is in itself divine revelation. When God says, I took you out of the land of Egypt, God is not just speaking truth, God is speaking fact. That's one level of belief that he says. And the way that he comes to explain this, he says, man apprehends in many ways, by intuition, inspiration, experience, deductions, and by direct instruction. The divine will, if it is to be made known, is sufficiently important for it to be revealed in as a direct, unequivocal, and unambiguous a manner as possible, so that it is to be understood by the largest number of people to whom this will is addressed. Language, though so faulty an instrument, is still the best means of communication to most human beings. His argument essentially is that God dictated or wrote or explained the Torah out through language, even though language is a little bit faulty. We know that. How many times do you mess up when you want to say one thing and you mean another? Sort of like what Mark Twain famously wrote, the problems with imprecise language is the difference between lightning and lightning bug, for example. Right? This idea that you have to be as precise as possible, but language itself is faulty. So he says that one of the reasons why the Torah is divine is because he would say it's because it's clear. And it's trying to be ubiquitous. It's trying to broadcast it out to as many people as possible. Then he goes on to say, that he qualifies a little bit. He says, exactly how this communication took place, no one can say. It is no less mysterious than the nature of the one who spoke, meaning God. The divine-human encounter is not a meeting of equals, and this kirgaima, this message, that ensues from this event must therefore be articulated in human terms without reflecting on the mode and form of the divine logos, or the divine essence. How God spoke is a mystery. How Moses received this message is an irrelevancy. That God spoke is of the utmost significance, and what he said must therefore be intelligible to in a human context, even if one insists upon an endlessly profound mystical overplus of meaning in the text. To deny that God can make his will clearly known is to impose upon him, God, a limitation of dumbness that would insult the least of his human creatures. So what is Rabbi Lamb ultimately saying? We don't quite know exactly what happened in this encounter at, let's call it Sinai. We don't know exactly what happened. We don't know, because language can only capture so much. But to think that God would not reveal the Torah clearly to human beings, especially to Moses, let's say, is to put God in a category of lesser than God itself. Why would I think the most supra-intelligent being that created the universe would not be able to figure out in God's own mind how to communicate God's own will to human beings? Now, I know it's hard for me to necessarily communicate my will to my own children because they never listen to me. And I certainly know that I'm not able to communicate what I want to my wife because we can never decide what we want for dinner. That is typical human being interaction. But to limit that kind of lack of communication to God limits God. That itself is a mistake. And so to say that when you read the Torah, and you can come to try to find what he calls a supra overplus of mystical interpretation. That means all the different meanings that a particular text can be in the moment that you're interpreting it. He says, even with all of that, there is truth in there because we know that it is in relationship to the Kodesh Baruch Hu, who revealed God's self and God's will to the people, because God is in that category of being able to do it. So, in this first chapter, when we look at modernity, Rabbi Lamb did something very interesting. Well, first, he uses some Greek terms, which makes you think that, oh, okay, so he's engaging with the outside world. Right? He uses the word logos, for example, right? But he did a really interesting thing. He's trying to center the moment of revelation beyond the experience that you or I have. Right? That moment of revelation was either in the past, in the myth, and the content of that revelation must have been clear, but the interpretation of the content of that revelation to him either seems irrelevant because the revelation happened or needs interpretation. So here I would even submit to you that Rabbi Lamb moves in a direction that says interpretation is the entirety of our ability to have the knowledge of what could have possibly maybe have happened at Sinai. But we know that it happened. And because we know that it happened, it is not just an article of fact, it is an article of faith. So the response to modernity from this particular writer's perspective when it comes to reading the Torah is that it begins with a leap of faith. That what you're reading in front of you is the best account possible of an actual encounter between infinity and finitude, between God and human beings. Okay? Not actually so far from a classic rabbinic position, but entering into the world of interpretation, entering into that 20th century strength of a human being and our ability to confront, read, and center ourselves as readers of the text. So he's doing that. Okay, the second one is from a professor, Emil Fackenheim, famous post-Holocaust professor. He has a similar position, but it's slightly nuanced differently, so I just want to tease that out. So he says, this is the second paragraph. Everyone with me? He says, the Torah reflects actual events of divine revelation, or, if you would, incursions into human history. Not a mistaken human belief in such incursions. That's a funny way of saying that this thing happened, and don't think about it just as how we believe about this thing happened. Just start with the fact that this thing happened. Actual divine events, incursions into the interactions between human beings in the world, not just a possibly mistaken belief that these things happen. Okay? But then he goes on to say, but it is human reflection of these events of incursion The reception is shot through with the appropriation and interpretation. You have to be able to interpret anytime something happens, you have to be able to interpret that event. Again, this is the sort of more modern perspective coming through. So then this is the core of his argument. Even a human listening to a human voice is inevitably an interpretator, or he says interpreting. This is all the more so a fortiori inevitable when the human listening is in faith and the voice heard is divine. Anytime we have a conversation between you and me, or between you and someone you love, or between you and a stranger, every conversation, the data transmitted in that conversation is meaningless unless the person receiving that data is able to interpret it. That's what he's trying to say. And if that's true between you and me, how much more so if the voice is coming from heaven and it's from God? You cannot understand what is happening in the world without interpreting those events. You are an interpreter first. That's what he's trying to say. He's locating the human being more forthrightly in this process than Rabbi Lamb is by saying that each of us at the very beginning of our lives is both an interpreter and in some sense a translator. Translating the data of the world as is presented to us into something intelligible that we can understand, putting ourselves into that process. And he says this rejects on the one hand the view that God simply dictated to Moses a mere secretary. Okay, and then skip the paragraph for a second, the parentheses. It says, it rejects on the other hand any liberal dispensation, I can't speak tonight, dissipation, thank you, of the event of divine incursion into just creative and human insight, making for revelation by those who achieve it. That is to say, on the one hand, if you understand that you as a human being are a strict interpreter and translator of everything that comes at you, then you can say that what God dictated to Moses on Mount Sinai is explicit, literal, fundamental, unchanging, unwavering, because Moses had to interpret the words that God said to him on Sinai. And then we, in turn, interpret Moses' words. So we are an interpretation of an interpretation already. So on the one hand, you can't say that everything that God said was literal. Rabbi Lamb is willing to go there in a way that Emil Fackenheim is not. On the other hand, he says, you can't just sublimate God into insight. That is to say, you can't be, you're not God. And that when you have a eureka moment, that doesn't mean that God is in that moment. That's you. That's you having congratulations, you're having a eureka moment. But don't think that eureka moment elevates itself level to divinity. It might be an echo of it. It might be a pale, afterglow of some kind of divine revelation. But your own scientific or poetic insight is not divine. So if you understand that, and you understand where he's coming from, he says, then we're now stuck in the middle somewhere. God didn't dictate the Torah directly to Moses because that's impossible. Because Moses is a human being and an interpreter. And at the same time, our regular, everyday experience of inspiration and insight cannot rise to the level of the broadcast or revelation that God was giving in those moments. So that means that when we see the Torah, and we're stuck in between these two poles, and when we see the Torah, we see it reflecting actual events from heaven as refracted and broken and put through the mill of interpretation over and over again through millennia, thousands of years. That's what he thinks it is. Right? So it's no longer a fundamental text. It is only a text that is subject now to interpretation. But there's a kernel there of truth and fact. Okay? So this gets even more complicated. You're ready to keep going down the road here. It gets even more complicated. There's Rabbi Benzi Boxer was a wonderful rabbi, again, late 20th century, and he takes this idea of the commingling of our experience and together with the universe and tries to bring the Torah into that process. He says, the human and divine commingle in all of life. A farmer tills the soil, plants, weeds, harvests, but this does not contradict a dimension of divine providence at work in the same process of bringing food from the earth. For the farmer did not create the earth with its power to fructify and to seed and placed in its womb, did not create the economy of nature on which the labor depends. He did not stuff the sun with energy, nor fill the clouds with rain, nor did he fashion the seed with its miraculous power to reproduce itself. Basically, the farmer uses the materials at hand to create food to eat, but didn't create the world. And that's like that famous joke. 3,000 years in the future, scientists finally figure out how to create life out of anything they want. And they knock on heaven's door. And they meet God. And they say, God, we've figured out how to create life from nothing. We appreciate the role you've had in the creation of the universe for all these thousands of years. Your job has now been outsourced. You are dismissed. Goodbye. And God said, really? Really? You can create a human being from dust? Oh, yeah, we know how to do that. And God says, show me. So they reach down to the earth and they scoop up a big pile of dust. And God says, no, go get your own dust. Benji Boxer is saying something very similar here. We exist in this world, but we didn't create this world. We inhabit a world that we've inherited in one way or another. And so that means that the thing that we've inherited and where it comes from, that itself, Benzi is saying, is God. Rabbi Boxer is saying we are then by nature a partner to God. That's the commingling part, right? And so he says that at the end here, the partnership between God and man or human beings is similarly at work in bringing forth the truth on which our souls are nourished. Man receives a divine communication in the moment when the divine spirit rests on him. But man must give to that communication. He must express it in words, in images and symbols, which will make his message intelligible to other men. Out of this need to give form to truth, that is revealed to him the prophet that places the stamp of his own individuality upon the truth. He draws upon his own experience, upon the idiom current in his time. He creates images that will be familiar to his people. Thus, the truth becomes personalized. It takes upon itself the robes of the world in which it is to enter to perform its work of moral and spiritual transformation. In the process of expression and transmission, truth takes on a historical dimension, which the historian can examine by the tools of historical investigation. But all this in no way invalidates the role of the divine factor, the initial breathing in on the prophet of the message which is called to proclaim to the people of his time. What Rabbi Boxer is saying is that when you look at the world and you feel enlightened or inspired, it's not just coming from you. It's not just coming from you. Because the thing you are inspired by, the moment that you feel the uplift, the eureka, you're responding to a world. And that world that you find yourself in is not your world. It's God's world. Which means in those moments of truth, those moments of inspiration, those moments of knowledge, they don't come from inside of you. It is a partnership from your faculty of understanding and inspiration in partnership with the external world in which you inhabit. And if that is the case, then when we look at the Torah and we find its truths and its miracles and its inspiration, it didn't just come from the human beings that captured those moments in words, myths, and symbols. But those words, myths, and symbols are embedded in the larger universe in which those writers found themselves. And in that sense, the Torah is divine. because it is in partnership with the greater expanse of the universe. And so when we approach the Torah and read it and study it, it itself is a divine document because it is a product of the thousands of years of partnership between a human being and the universe in which that human being inhabits. All right, so that's the third different interpretation. Should I review them again? Are we going too fast? Should I review them again? So Rabbi Lamb is saying these things actually happened. We don't know exactly the content, but we know how it was written down and spun out. But this is when we read the Torah, the words that are there capture things that actually happened. Right? And Emil Fackentheim says, I agree with that, except the human role in that process is much greater than you're realizing, and that what the events that actually happened were interpreted so much that they have to be interpreted so much, that we ourselves, our agency in that process, begin to change them, which means that they're not fundamental facts. They might be eternal truths, but they're not fundamental facts. And because of that, it's our role to continuously interpret and mold and shape and be experienced by the law. And then comes Rabbi Boxer, who says, I'm not sure at all that those things actually happened. But I know that the writers of the Torah themselves felt inspired. And if they felt inspired, then their inspiration comes from a divine place, and then therefore I'm going to treat the Torah as divine because it is a book of divinity in the sense that it's a book of inspiration. Right? So each one is going down this path where the reader and the writer become more and more important, and frankly, the God conversation begins to recede farther and farther back. And then comes our beloved Rabbi Schulweis. As Rabbi Feinstein told me, this is early Schulweis, which means it's completely unintelligible. So I'll try to go a little slow as we go through it, because he liked to use 4 and 5 syllable words. I think sometimes just for the sake of it. So he says the Torah is the selective record of Israel's extraordinary religious interpretation of its collective experience during the formative period of its career. I always thought that was a weird word because, when did Israel have a career? So it's a selective record, meaning they chose what to put in and what not to put in, of Israel's extraordinary religious interpretation, not of the events, but of the interpretation, of its collective experience, not an individual experience, but a collective experience, during the early part of Israel's career. Okay, so I'm not sure where we are now. Maybe we're mid-career Israel. I'm not really sure. It could be late-career Israel. The origin of the Torah lies not in an extra-mundane source, which has cast down absolute truths upon a receiving people. That's a fancy way of saying God didn't write the Torah literally. Nor is it the arbitrary projection of human inventiveness flung upward, meaning we didn't write it ourselves just one afternoon. Torah is rooted in the matrix of a living organism, in a people which discovers out of its existence with failure and fortune the powers of godliness residing within it and its total environment. Torah as revelation is the product of Israel's creative transaction with history. Out of this experience has been extracted the insight of cosmic moral teleology, which serves Israel as its dominant interpretive principle of history. Out of the collective experience of insight, of interactions with the world, the people of Israel, some thousands of years, wrote down those interactions with myths and symbols in order to uncover simply this, what they felt was a cosmic moral goal. The cosmic moral goal being, in his interpretation, of being good, holy, and just. And so, therefore, the attributes ascribed to divinity, the act of naming that which is holy, the consecration of particular deeds and potential energies, the enunciation of prescriptions and proscriptions are revelatory disclosures wrought out of the wrestlings of our people with idolatry, superstition, and enslavement, and out of their acknowledgement of such values as compassion, justice, peace, and freedom as the forces upon which life depends or its meaning. He says that what they chose to call divine were the morals that they wished they could achieve either in their lifetime or over the course of many lifetimes. And then out of that was the pushing out of negative energy, of idolatry, of superstition, of enslavement. And in the quintessential act of the Torah is to push those values out and instead to seize at the divine level the ideas of justice, compassion, and peace and freedom. And he says, life depends on that. He goes on to say, the sanctity of Torah revelation lies not in the perfection of its authorship, nor in its absolute finality. The Torah is holy not because it is the last word, but because it is the first self-conscious word of Judaism, which reveals the direction of its moral thrust. The holiness of Torah does not require that its contents be held infallible or immutable. Therefore, meaning, the authority of the Torah as it was given to us was the collective interpretation in early Israel's life of wrestling away the negative attributes and values that they saw of a disgusting society in order to achieve supreme values they're willing to call divine, like justice, peace, compassion, and freedom. And that means that if we were to come to the Torah again and to read it in our day, we cannot take anything that happened in the Torah literally. We only must read it through the events as expressed metaphorically. And therefore, if the words that we find in the Torah feel to us no longer like words that express justice, peace, freedom, and compassion, we have every right, just as our forefathers did and their ancestors did, essentially to rewrite the Torah so that it expresses the values for our day. That's Rabbi Schulweis's theology. That's Rabbi Schulweis's gift to the community, was to release us of any of the supernaturalism that exists in the other interpretations. Those are 4 interpretations. 1, Rabbi Lamb, who believes in a more stilted and focused version of Revelation and how we deal with the Torah. Number 2, Emil Fackenheim, who believed that the Torah's facts were probably true on some level, but we cannot escape our ability to interpret them. You have Benzi Boxer, who says that they were divinely inspired events, but divinely inspired itself is divine because we're embedded in a larger world. And Rabbi Schulweis, who says, forget all of that, just think of it as a community, a nation's expression of its own deepest values, codified in the time when it was able to be codified, but given to us for us to wrestle with those same values in every generation. 4 different interpretations. I could probably come up with 5 or 6 more, but those were the interpretations. And for the last part, before we go to a break, I want you to return to October 4th, 1957. When Sputnik flew around the world. Khrushchev said, we looked to heaven, we saw nothing there, God doesn't exist. And then I want you to go back to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 CE. Because we had the same moment. The Romans sacked the village, they sacked the city, they breached the walls. They came up to the Temple Mount. They burst into the temple through the courtyards, spears in hand, swords in hand, slaughtering anyone they found along the way. They went into the outer courtyard and then the inner courtyard. They crossed over the altar and they finally made it into the Holy of Holies. Legend has it they were scared to go in because, after all, what were we learned? What did we learn about the Holy of Holies? That's where God lives, in that room. And the holy high priest can only go into that room once a year with a rope tied around his ankle. Because if he were to actually see God in that room, what would happen? He would die and we'd have to pull him out. But no one wants to go in, so he got to pull him out by the rope. They're standing there, they're afraid. What happens if they go in that room and see God? So rather than go in, they start shoving their spears into the room, throwing javelins into the room. Finally, they get up the courage to tear down the parochet, the cloth that separates the Holy of Holies from the rest of the world, and they run into the room, stabbing and not really sure, and guess what they found? An empty room. There's nothing there. Nothing at all. So what kind of religion builds a temple around an empty room? What kind of religion tells that the most holy place in the earth is a storage closet that's empty? It's the kind of religion, to me, that says everything that we're doing here is using the wrong part of our brains. The part of our brain that wishes to know, that wishes to expand our knowledge, that wishes to test things empirically. That's a valuable part. That's a drive that we have. We want to continue to know more and more and more and more and more. But it's a category mistake to think that's where religion should actually sit. Because there's another drive inside of us. And that's a drive to become known, to enter into relationship, to be known by people that love you, for people to know what hurts you, for people to know what makes you feel empowered and inspired. And so when Khrushchev looked to the space and saw God not there, or the Romans walked into the Holy of Holies and found God not there, they made a category mistake. They came to try to know God empirically, and guess what they found? An empty room or an empty expanse. Instead, I would like to argue that from a religious standpoint, the Torah, as we know it, the question of its own divinity, and asking whether or not the events that existed in the Torah itself were divine or not divine, factual, historical or not, to me is a category mistake. Because it is not in the realm just of knowledge. We're now moving into the realm of relationship. And for that, I want to teach you two midrashim, two texts. The first is from Breshit Rabbah. This will open up for discussion tonight with Rabbi Feinstein. I'm at the bottom of the second page. Rabbi Yoshaya opened his sermon on the verse in Proverbs saying, "Then I was with him as an Ammon, and I was daily all delight." What is Ammon? Ammon is a workman. The Torah declares, I was God's working tool. In human practice, when a king builds a palace, he builds it not with his own skill, but with the skill of an architect. The architect, moreover, does not build it out of his head, but employs plans and diagrams to know how to arrange the chambers and the doors. Thus God consulted the Torah and created the world. So the Torah declares, in the beginning, Bereshit, God created Reshit, which refers to the Torah as in the verse, the Lord made me as the beginning, or Reshit, on his way. Here in the Midrash, it's saying that before the world existed, there was Torah. That Torah itself is a blueprint, a diagram for how the world should be constructed. Now, the rabbis might have meant that means that the Torah is the one that dictates how tall a tree should be or how the sun should rise and fall. But the mystics never understood it that way. The mystics didn't think that the Torah dictated those things. The mystics believed that God created the world out of the letters of the Torah itself, twisting and turning the shapes to create the world as we know it. In fact, if you look behind me carefully, you'll see a mystical interpretation of this midrash all along this wall, because if you look under the ground in this orchard arbor here, the Hebrew letters of the Torah are found. It's hard to see, but maybe at the break. Right? And if you look up at the ladders here, right, and you look at the Torah portions inscribed along the arbor, they're meant to look a little bit like the double helix, like DNA. I could teach an entire hour on the window, by the way. Okay, what's the point? The point is, it's not science. It's poetry. The architecture that God wanted to build out of the world was not how long, how deep the Grand Canyon can become. It's about building the architecture of relationships. The idea of wisdom. The idea of how we interpret our lives means how we're going to relate to other people. The text even here in Proverbs, when it says, the Lord made me at the beginning of his way, which comes from Proverbs, the first line of this is Reshit Chochmah, is in the beginning of wisdom is Yirat Adonai, is the fear of God. So it's not a matter of what you know and how to expand your knowledge so you acquire knowledge of the world. It's a matter of being known, of putting yourself out there, of being vulnerable, allowing yourself to be caught when you fall and lifted up when you succeed, and falling in love and falling out of love. That's the architecture from which God built the world, not just what color a leaf of an oak tree is supposed to be. Which leads me to the second midrash. This is a famous one. Imagine Moses has passed away and we're sometime in the future in the rabbinic period, and now Moses is up in heaven. Because Moses gets to be in heaven because Moses is Moses, right? So when Moses ascended on high, he found the Holy One engaged in affixing the coronets to the letters. You ever read the Torah and see little swills and swishes on top of the Hebrew letters, right? So he sees God drawing or tying, he would say in the Hebrew, tying these letters to the top of the Torah, of the letters of the Torah, okay? And he says, Lord of the universe, who stays your hand? Why are you doing this? And God says, well, there'll arise a man at the end of many generations, Akiva ben Yosef by name, who will expound upon each jot and tittle, heaps upon heaps of laws. And if we know anything, and we'll get into this with Rabbi and Dr. Leibowitz, that the interpretation Rabbi Akiva says is every little jot and tittle in the Torah is worthy of interpretation. So that's what Moses is. That's what God is saying to Moses here, is that there comes a man who can do this. Okay. And he says, Lord of the universe, said Moses, permit me to see him. And God replied, turn around. So Moses went and sat down in the study house of Rabbi Akiva. So ostensibly Moses comes out of heaven in the rabbinic period and sits in the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva. Now it says, and this is very important, he sat behind 8 rows and listened to the discourses upon the law. So here's a little sociological fact for you. In the rabbinic period, your best students sat in the first row. And your second best students sat in the second row, and so on and so on. It goes, where's Moses in this text? In the 8th row. That should already clue into you what something strange is about to happen, because this is Moses, right? The best student of Torah that ever was, the one who received Torah from God, Moses, God's self, right? Here he is in the 8th row. He says, not being able to follow their arguments, he was ill at ease. But when they came to a certain subject, and the disciples said to the master, well, from where do you know this? And the latter, meaning the master, replied, it's a law given to Moses at Sinai. He was comforted. Moses was comforted. Thereupon he returned to the Holy One and said, Lord of the universe, you have such a man, and you give the Torah to me? And God replied, be silent, for such is my decree. So here Moses is sitting in the back of Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva. Rabbi Akiva is giving a discourse on something, and Moses has no clue what Rabbi Akiva is saying. He's in the back row. He doesn't even get to sit in the 3rd row, right? He's in the back row. And when a student in the 1st row says, hey, Rabbi, where are you learning this from? Rabbi Akiva says, well, this was given to Moses at Sinai. Halacha k'Moshe miSinai. And for that, Moses felt comforted, less upset. Which means that Moses maybe didn't get everything that God had told him at Sinai. But somehow Rabbi Akiva was able to understand something that Moses couldn't understand. Those jots and those tittles, those crowns, right? And so Moses goes back to God and says, look, God, why did you give the Torah to me? Why didn't you give it entirely to him? What was God's answer? Shh. This is what I decided. Then Moses said, Lord of the universe, you've shown me his Torah, now show me his reward. Obviously, he should be rewarded because he knows more Torah than Moses did himself, right? And so God said, turn around. And God said, and Moses turned around and saw them weighing out his flesh in the market stalls. Because Rabbi Akiva lived during the end of the Roman period and was part of the rebellion, a generation after the fall of the temple, and because of that he was captured and martyred. And they cut apart his body and sold it by weight in the market. And so Moses goes back to God and says, Lord of the universe, cried Moses, such is Torah and such is the reward. And God said, be silent, for such is my decree. What do we learn from this text? What do we learn? We learn that the Torah is not meant to be understood as strict science. There comes a limit to what we can know through science, and if we go all the way out to that empty expanse, that is exactly what we will find there. We'll find nothing, which means that we have to use a different faculty. Not one that searches to know, but one that searches to be known. And so today, I had an opportunity to teach the sixth graders. And I was teaching them about a man named Rashi. And we looked at this week's Torah portion, which is called Chaye Sarah. And the first pasuk, the first sentence of Chaye Sarah says, this was the life of Sarah. She lived to be 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. These were the lives of Sarah. And I asked them how old you are. And one of them says, I'm 11. And the other one says, I'm 1 week away from being 12. I said, well, why did you say that? She says, because I'm going to be 12 next week. I'm excited about becoming 12. And I said, now look at the Torah. How do they describe Sarah's life? They said it's 100 years plus 20 years plus 7 years. Does anyone say, I'm 11? Or do they say, I'm 6 years plus 4 years plus 1 year? No one does that, right? So Rashi asked the question, why is it written this way? And Rashi says it's because she was a woman who lived her life so full of goodness that when she was 100 years old, it was as if she was 20, and when she was 20, it was as if she was 7. And I asked them, well, what does that mean? Is this fact? Was she 127 years old? Like, now how can that be? And they started a whole conversation about like how we count in the Torah. I said, well, then what is Rashi trying to teach us here? Every year that you live has to be a year that you count for goodness. You have to live every year of your life to the fullest. You're a young kid, you're 11 years old. How many of you want to be older? People raised their hand. I said, tonight I'm teaching a bunch of people who are a little bit older than you. How many of them wish they were younger? I'm not going to make you raise your hands, okay? I said, some people would wish they were younger, and some people are happy with how old they are because they felt like the life that they lived was worth living. And so, why does the Torah describe this woman at the end of her life, Sarah, our mother, at the end of her life? Why does the Torah describe her in this way, 127 and 20 and 7? It's because it's not about the fact that she was 120 and 7 at all. It was because the Torah wanted to hint at us about something about our own life. And when you do that, you're no longer in the realm of science. You're in the realm of poetry. Because science cares about the world as it is, and poetry cares about the world as it interacts with the human soul. And to me, the Torah is poetry. It's not science. And that doesn't make it any less important. It actually makes it more important. Thank you very much. Have a great night. We'll talk again after. We'll have a little coffee break, and then Rabbi Feinstein and I will reconvene, and we'll take your questions, and we'll have a conversation too. Yes. question about access to, yeah.
Coffee break. Go get some coffee, get some cookies. Quick. You need nourishment to learn Torah.
Moving this? How are we doing this?
Let's put some chairs up there.